Good morning, everyone. Am I on? I'm Emily Gibbon. For those of us who don't know one another, I'm the Director of Christian Formation here, and I am so glad that you are here. This is the third and the last of Dr. Crystal Hall's time with us this week. And so I know that we've been giving a bio and talking about your coaching and talking about being a seminary professor. I'm just wondering if there's other things that feel like you'd like to introduce yourself through. Like, is there anything else you'd want to say about you that feels like it hasn't been said those other 2 weeks? All right, well then let's just start. Okay. Hold on 1 second. There we go, you're on.
All right, good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you so much for the invitation to be with you this morning again. It is a delight to see some returning faces and a delight to see some new faces. So just by way of introduction, I will reiterate that for those of you who have been here the past couple of Sundays, you know that I like to keep things pretty conversational. So for the folks that are here in person, for the folks that are joining online, I will say a few words of introduction, and then I will invite comment. And then I'll say a few more things, and I'll invite comment. So at any point, if you are wondering, Dr. Hall, what the heck did you just say? Or Dr. Hall, I have a question. We're gonna have a mic. So we want to be able to hear each other. So if at any point you have a question or a comment, don't hesitate to raise your hand, and we'll have the mic so that we can hear each other.
And if you're online and you have a question, you can go and leave an email, and we will respond right away at formationquestions@stdavidschurch.org. So formationquestions@stdavidschurch.org.
Awesome. All right. So for those of you who were here last week or the week before, we started digging into the historical context of Galatians and where it sits in the New Testament. What do you remember? I know it probably feels like a lifetime ago. What do you remember either from 2 weeks ago or from last week? For those of you who are joining us, what do you remember from what we talked about? Yes, please.
The most interesting thing to me was that there are 3 different Pauls. That there's the Paul, these letters, and then there's the Paul of...
If you could just hold the mic too.
Oh, sorry. The Paul who wrote these letters, then there's another Paul that was in the name of Paul, and then another Paul that was basically the church, leaders of the church.
Yes. So, thank you. Such an important point. So to summarize, we're focusing on Paul's letter to the Galatians, and there are, as you mentioned, there's the letters that are written by the historical figure called the authentic Paul or the historical Paul. So this is the Paul who is the apostle who's writing in the decade of the 50s of the first century of the Common Era. He writes 7 letters, including Galatians as well as Romans. But then there's also this practice in antiquity called pseudepigraphy, which is the fancy word. But basically what pseudepigraphy is the tradition of writing in the name of one's teacher. So this is not in any way plagiarism. This is not in any way seen as the stealing of intellectual property. None of that exists in the first century. But there is this tradition in the first century of writing in the name of one's teacher as a sign of deference and respect to the tradition. And so what that means is, so for example, when I did my PhD dissertation, my doctoral advisor's name was Brigida. Her first name was Brigida. And so if I was writing in this tradition, I would not write in my name. I would not write, I, Dr. Crystal Hall. No. If I was writing in this tradition, I would say, I, Brigida. Not because my name is Brigida, but because my teacher's name is Brigida. And so I would write in the name of my teacher as a sign of deference and respect to the tradition that had been handed on to me. Not because I'm trying to pass myself off as someone that I'm not, but I'm showing that I stand in a lineage of teachers. I'm showing that I stand in a tradition, and I respect that tradition not by writing in my own name, but by writing in the name of another. And so this tradition also exists in the New Testament. So there are letters that are written by a first generation of followers that come after Paul. So that's Ephesians and 2 Thessalonians and Colossians. These are letters that say, I, Paul, to the Ephesians, or I, Paul, to the church in Colossae, but these are actually letters that are not written by Paul himself, but are written by followers of Paul. Same issue with other letters within the New Testament. 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus are written by someone who's called the pastoral Paul. They're writing even a generation later, 2nd and 3rd generation. So this is why we have more than one Paul in the New Testament. This was not the main topic of our discussion last week, but I think it's important to reiterate. So we've got the Paul of Galatians, who's the Paul that we're going to focus on today, but then there are also other people who are disciples of Paul that write other letters that also are in the New Testament. Yes. What else do folks remember from last week or the week before? What else do you remember? Yes, right next to you.
You do keep reminding us that this is called the angry letter.
The angry letter, yes. Why is it called the angry letter?
Well, because he's irritated with some things that are going on in Galatia, and he needs to address that.
Yeah, do you remember what he's irritated about?
Well, there was a perception that people, in order to follow him, would have to go back and become authentically Jewish in order to do that, and he's disputing that.
Yes, exactly. So you're exactly right that Galatians is known as the angry letter because Paul is angry. So he's writing to these churches in Galatia, which anyone remember where Galatia is located today? Does anyone want to shout it out? Turkey, modern day Turkey. Yes, exactly. So Paul is writing to these churches in Galatia, which is now modern day Turkey. And the reason he's writing this letter, exactly as you said, is because Paul had founded this church. And then as Paul does, he goes off and then he goes and talks to some other people. And as he's off talking to these other people after he's founded this church, then there are these other teachers that come into these churches in Galatia and say, exactly as you said, you have to become Jewish, you have to be circumcised, you have to be Torah observant in order to become part of the church, in order to belong. So shorthand, what this means is that you have to become like us in order to belong. You can't be as you are, you can't be in your different identities, but you have to become like us in order to be part of the church. And exactly as you said, Paul's like, no, you got it all wrong. You totally missed the gospel that I was preaching to you when I was founding this church among you. Because the gospel that I preached is a gospel that says, remain as you are. That you don't have to become Jewish in order to be part of the church. You don't have to become Jewish in order to become a Jesus follower, but in your diversity as people of this province of Galatia, whether you were previously worshipers of the Greco-Roman gods, if you were previously worshipers of the gods of the local places in Galatia, it doesn't matter. Because now you get to be a part of the church and you get to keep your culture, you keep your language, you keep your identity. You don't have to become something other than you are in order to be part of the church. And so this is why Paul is just so mad in this letter. Yes, do we have someone online?
Sure. So Leslie Lewis is online, and she said, Paul was angry because the churches in the area of Galatia were not following what he believed to be true. Mm-hmm. The churches were saying that the people had to be true to the laws of Judaism.
Exactly. Yep, that is exactly right. All right. Anything else that folks remember either from 2 weeks ago or last week from our discussions? Yes, please.
So is this where the argument between you get to heaven by faith versus you get to heaven by works comes from?
Yes.
Is this the first, is this a break with saying that you have to obey every single law of the Torah, and it doesn't matter what you do, it matters what you believe?
So this issue of faith versus works is one that is core to Galatians, absolutely. But it is not an issue that is anyway newly being debated by the church, because this whole issue of faith and works and the relationship to the law, to the covenant, all of these issues are indigenous to Judaism itself. So even Judaism has its own ideas of forgiveness and redemption and right relationship. These all already exist within Judaism. And now Paul, as a Jew, is reinterpreting what does it mean to observe the law? What does it mean to be in right relationship? How is God calling God's people into relationship now in light of Jesus? So we talked last week and the week before about how Paul is a Jew, and Paul remains a Jew throughout his life. He's a particular kind of Jew now because of the relationship that he now has with Jesus. Because, as we talked about, especially in the first week, Paul receives this new call. In the tradition of a prophetic call, in the traditions of Isaiah and Jeremiah, that Paul receives a new call to preach a gospel specifically to the Gentiles, which just means non-Jews. So Paul, as a Jew, receives this call to preach the gospel of Christ crucified to the Gentiles, the non-Jews, meaning people who are not like him. So Paul, as a Jew, is continually being called out to be in relationship with the other. He's continuously being called to be in relationship, to preach the gospel to people who are totally different than him. How different would Christianity be today if we always felt that call into relationship with people who are different than us? I wonder how the church might look different today. But I'm not going to preach today. We're just going to focus on the biblical text. All right, so this is Paul, and this is who he is. He is a Jew who's received this call from God to preach Christ crucified specifically to the nations, to the Gentiles who are the non-Jews. So this issue of faith and works is core to Galatians, because what Paul is saying is that God has called God's people into right relationship through Christ. That through what God has done on the cross, through Christ crucified, that people are now called into a different kind of relationship with God. That people are called into right relationship through Jesus and not through works of the law. So to be justified, to be brought into right relationship by grace, means through faith in Jesus and not through Torah observance, not through anything that you do or don't do in relationship to the law. But because the law is upheld, that doesn't mean nothing matters anymore. It doesn't matter that it doesn't matter what you do, right? The law is still upheld, but the law is fulfilled. And there is a new relationship to the law, and these are exactly the sorts of issues that are being worked out in a letter like Galatians. Okay, any final questions or comments about anything we've covered so far before we dig specifically into chapter 5 and 6? All right, here we go. So you remember last week how I talked about we've been circling around the fruits of the Spirit in chapter 5. And remember, there are 3 sections of Galatians. We talked about last week, chapters 1 and 2 is where Paul summarizes his story. Chapters 3 and 4 is where basically Paul provides the biblical basis of his argument by looking at Genesis and Exodus. And then chapter 5 and 6 is the so what section. This is okay, in light of everything that I've been teaching you, this is how you embody that. This is what you do about it as church. Does anyone remember the fancy word for this section from last week? No? This is the paranesis. So you can use this at a cocktail party. In the parenetical section of Galatians in chapters 5 and 6, Paul okay, we won't do that. Okay, so the paranesis, the parenetical section, is the so what section. It's the ethics section. It's the how do we embody this teaching that Paul is preaching as a church. And so we've been circling around the fruits of the Spirit, and so I'm just going to do a little bit of reading and commenting. But before I do that, I just want to provide one more piece of context, which is that Paul is considered what's called an apocalyptic writer. Okay, and so when I say apocalyptic here, I do not mean gloom and doom and the end of the world, right? This is the very sort of pop culture understanding of this word apocalyptic. But apocalyptic literature in the first century of the Common Era is based on the Greek word apocalypsis. The Greek word apocalypsis. And what this word in Greek, apocalypsis, means is an uncovering or an unveiling, making seen of what has previously been unseen. So imagine a bud, the bud of a flower is all tightly bound, but then when the bud of the flower is apocalypsed, it's revealed. So imagine that bud then becomes visible, what was previously invisible. So when we're talking about apocalypse in that context, that making seen of what was previously unseen, the way that this language is described in literature in the first century is in very binary language. So there's a lot of, well, there's good and there's evil, there's right and there's wrong, there's heaven and earth, there's flesh and spirit. So there's a lot of over and against kind of language. And so I want you to really pay attention to that as I'm doing some reading here, because there's a lot of language here about how one thing exists over and against another thing. So just be on the lookout and be listening for that as I do some reading here. Okay. So we started in these first couple of weeks with the fruits of the Spirit, but now that we've got all this socio-historical context and how this letter sits within the New Testament, let's now look a little bit at the literary context as well. But before we get there,
Leslie is joining us again, and she said, we also learned that different Bibles use different translations
Yes.
that affects the words that were published, which then can really impact the message, what the message means in this letter.
yes, such an important point that we've also talked about, that all translation is interpretation. All translation is interpretation, because I don't think it's going to come as a shock to anybody in this room that the Bible was not written in English. The Bible was originally, at least this part of the Bible, the New Testament, was written in Koine Greek, so the common Greek of the first century. And so because there's always a movement from the original language to English or any other modern language, that means that there are interpretive choices that inherently need to be made in going from the original language to the modern language. And so because there's no one-to-one correspondence between one language and another. It's not a plug and play. We can't just take one word and substitute another word. We have to understand the historical context. We have to understand the grammatical structures. We add on top of that we only have copies of anything in the New Testament. We have no original documents. None of that is available to scholarship. You can see how complicated this gets pretty quickly, yeah? Okay. So all translation is interpretation. We are reading this letter in translation. I'm not gonna lecture on the original Greek here because we don't have time for that. But we're gonna look specific. I'm gonna read from the New Revised Standard Version, recognizing that there are gonna be other versions that you're either reading on your phones or if you have a physical Bible in front of you, either here or at home. Just be aware that there's gonna be some differences between what I'm reading and maybe what you're reading, and that's totally normal, because every translation committee and every translator is going to be making different interpretive choices about how to negotiate between what's in the original language and then what's in the translation. Okay, all that to say, now we're going to look at, so our theme has been the fruits of the Spirit, but as I promised, we're going to look at that in a little bit of context. And remember how I was talking about those binaries or those opposites? That's very characteristic of this type of literature. So I'm going to give you an example of that by reading in the immediate context of Galatians, the end of chapter 5, where we had the fruits of the Spirit. We're going to back up just a little bit. And we're going to look at chapter 5, starting at verse 16. So chapter 5, so if you have a physical Bible with you, it's going to be about here in the Bible. It's going to be toward the end. So I'm going to start in chapter 5, verse 16, which, at least in my Bible, they're all going to have different subheadings, but the subheading in my Bible is the works of the flesh. Interesting. All right. So we're going to start there for a little bit of context. So this is chapter 5, starting at verse 16. I'm reading from the New Revised Standard Version. So Paul writes to the churches in Galatia, "Live by the Spirit, I say, and do not gratify the desires of the flesh." So here's the first binary set of relationships. We have the Spirit that's being established over and against the flesh. I'm going to come back to that and talk about that a little bit more in a second. Verse 17, "For what the flesh desires is opposed to the Spirit, and what the Spirit desires is opposed to the flesh." Notice this conflict, saying, well, the Spirit wants this thing, the flesh wants this thing. They are opposed to one another. "For these are opposed to each other to prevent you from doing what you want." Okay, let me pause there. So it's very easy to read this as the heavenly spiritual realm over and against the earthly fleshly realm. It's very easy to say, oh, well, up here in heaven we have the Spirit versus down here on earth we have the flesh. These two forces are in conflict with one another. We should always be looking up to heaven or to the future, right? It's very easy to read the text this way. And this would be a very pious way to read it, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. And another, I think, layer that we might consider in a text like this is that both the Spirit and the flesh exist on the earthly plane. Both the Spirit and the flesh exist on the earthly plane, in the sense that the Spirit is something that is being embodied within the church in the here and now, and not in just some heavenly pie in the sky beyond. That this is a reality that Paul is arguing is embodied within the church itself. It's not just something up in heaven, it's not just something that's coming later, but it's something that is alive and moving within the church itself. So when you hear Spirit and flesh, I want you to be careful about how you're thinking about that binary. Okay, let me read a little more. So chapter 5, I'm going to continue at verse 18. "But if you are led by the Spirit, you are not subject to the law." This gets back to some of that relationship between grace and works that we were talking about earlier. Verse 19, "Now the works of the flesh are obvious: fornication, impurity, licentiousness, idolatry, sorcery, enmity, strife, jealousy, anger, quarrels, dissensions, factions, envy, drunkenness, carousing, and things like these. I am warning you, as I warned you before, those who do such things will not inherit the kingdom or the reign of God." Oof, this is tough language. I wonder what it'd be like to read this on Super Bowl Sunday last week. We didn't look at this part particularly, but just to have a little fun with it. So this list of vices, if you will, this list of vices, it's what's being contrasted with the fruits of the Spirit, which we'll look at in a moment. But what I want you to notice about this list is that these are vices, if you will, that tear apart the community. These are forces that Paul is especially concerned about because of the way that they break down community and they divide people from one another. This is Paul's a special concern with this set of vices. It's not about morality per se, but it's about what does not build up the church, what does not build up the community that Paul is arguing for so strongly in this letter. So when he's talking here about flesh, he's using it in a particular and technical sense. He's not talking about our physical bodies. Flesh here is actually a theological concept of what stands against God, what stands against community. And so flesh here is not about our physical bodies, because remember how I said spirit and flesh are both concepts that are embodied in the here and now? So flesh here means something very specific in that it is what divides the community and it is what stands against God and the church. So it's not flesh here, don't read flesh as flesh, because that's not what Paul is talking about here. Because for Paul, spirit is also in the body. So that's a really important distinction that I think is easy to miss in a text like this. All right, let me pause here. What are your questions and reflections on what I have described so far? Yeah, please.
He does say fornication.
Yes, he does say fornication. Okay, let's go back to the original Greek here. I love it. This is so fun. So, fornication here is a terrible translation. Because fornication implies sexual immorality of sex outside of marriage. That's what's being implied with a translation like fornication. But the original Greek word here is porneia, which is actually where the English word pornography comes from. So porneia in Greek actually means something specific. It doesn't mean sex outside of marriage. It doesn't mean the breaking of the marriage covenant. Porneia in the original Greek actually means the buying and selling of sex for profit. And so, yeah, I know. And so porneia in the original Greek is actually about the sex trade. It's about the economic exploitation of people's bodies, and that's the specific concern. Is that the way it's translated in most of your Bibles? Of course not.
How did it get lost in translation?
The question was, how did it get lost in translation? There is so much that gets lost in translation. Yeah.
Big.
I agree. That's why it's so important that we come together and study these kinds of texts and look at these kinds of issues of translation in the original language, because you are absolutely not the first person who's had that reaction of, what do you mean? What are you talking about? So that's why it's so important not only to read these texts. I'm not gonna make the argument that you should all go and study Greek, although that would be fabulous. But this is why it's so important to be able to read across multiple translations, to notice, oh, okay, well, this translation says this, but this translation says this, but this translation says this. Why? And then you have someone like me come in and say, well, the reason why there's this variation among the translations is because in the original Greek, da-da-da-da-da. Yes?
What translations?
Oh, hang on. Oh, go ahead.
I hate these things. Are there translations that actually do put in that porneia and take out fornication so that you have a different understanding? Or is fornication all we're left with?
Fornication is the overwhelming English translation that you will see these days.
But if it's wrong, then why is it in every Bible?
Yes.
That was my point. Are there existing texts now that I could go to a store and buy that give that different translation?
Probably not.
Okay.
Yeah. Which is super frustrating, right? Yeah.
So I'm going to go to the one and cross that out.
Yeah. And other questions or comments? I wasn't expecting to talk about fornication today, but it's fun. I feel like every time I teach the book of Galatians, because it's a very embodied text, right? It's a very fleshy text. And so these issues of body and embodiment are inherent to this letter of the Galatians, and we shouldn't shy away from that, because I think church folks are often, we're socialized to think that, oh, well, we shouldn't necessarily bring our bodies to church, or that like we're taught to be somewhat, I think, sort of disassociated with or uncomfortable in our bodies. And so there's, I think, so many ways in which a text like Galatians is calling us back into relationship with being in your body and with being comfortable talking about all this fleshiness. So it's there. It's inherent to the text. It's biblical. There you go. Other questions or reflections about what we've talked about so far? Okay, you ready to talk about the fruits of the Spirit now? Okay. So, I'm going to continue in verse 22. So, chapter 5, verse 22, starting, again, I'm reading from the New Revised Standard Version. So, notice, by contrast, this section now starts by contrast. So, if you're just reading this section, the fruits of the Spirit, in isolation, your first question might be, well, in contrast to what? And this is why we read in context. That's why we looked at the works of the flesh first, and then now we're looking at the fruits of the Spirit today, so that first phrase, by contrast, actually makes a little more sense now. We know what the fruits of the Spirit are being contrasted to. So, verse 22, by contrast, the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. So, we have another list. So remember, in the works of the flesh, so-called, we had a list of things that tear apart the community, things that divide the church. And now, Paul here says, by contrast, I'm not going to just leave you with the things that aren't working. I'm also going to give you a list of the things that do work for building up the community. And so he gives this list of these virtues of things that build up the church, things that call people into relationship with one another. So again, we could spend all day on translation, but we're not going to. But the one word in this list that I want to draw out for you is faithfulness. Faithfulness. And so the Greek word here is pistis, which means faith. It's often translated as faith, but it also means trust. It also means trust. So when Paul talks in Galatians about we are called by grace through faith, it's this same word pistis, but it would be just as easy and just as accurate to translate it as we are called by grace through trust. How does that change it for you? Or does it change it for you? Do you hear it any differently, knowing that that's another possible translation here? I'm curious if there's any reactions to that. I saw some nodding, so I'm going to go with that. And if there's any further thoughts or comments about that, let's hear them. Okay, so let's continue. This is in the middle of verse 23. There is no law against such things. There is no law against things like love, joy, patience, kindness, etc. Verse 24. And those who belong to Christ Jesus have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. Okay, so this comes back to what we were talking about just a couple of minutes ago, where it would be very easy to read this verse, and those who belong to Christ Jesus have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. Now, it would be very easy to read this as an anti-body kind of text, to say that the problem is the human body, the problem is human desire, the problem is our embodiedness as people. But remember, what does the flesh mean in this context? The flesh is specifically those things that tear apart the community, the things that break down the church. So Paul is not arguing here that the problem is our physical bodies. Paul is not saying that the desires of the flesh are when you get hungry. That's not what Paul is saying here. Paul is saying that the problem is when we desire to tear others down, when we desire to create conflict, when we desire to put our own cravings above our desire to be in community. Paul is saying that's what the problem is. And that's specifically what he means when he's talking about the flesh that needs to be crucified with its passions and desires. He's not talking about the problematicness of our human bodies. He's talking about the specific ways that tearing apart the community is holding the church back from becoming what it could truly be when it embodies the fruits of the Spirit. Okay, let me pause here again. Comments, questions, reflections. We just covered a whole bunch of things, so I will wait. What are your thoughts? Hang on.
If the spirit and the body are one thing, right? And we crucify the body, are we actually not crucifying physical flesh, but the spirit?
Yeah, so the thing that Paul is calling people to crucify specifically is the flesh. And if flesh means the things that tear apart community, he's not talking about crucifying the human body. He's not saying that the human body is the problem. He's saying the ways in which the body and our minds are used to tear apart community, that's what needs to be crucified. That's what needs to go away. What are your other questions and reflections? I can see there's percolating and thinking. This is why I love doing these in person, because I can get the energy of okay, what are we contemplating here? Yes, if you could just wait for the mic.
How is that being transmitted physically? How is that? Is that by personal speech, by some form of written communication, by large groups, by small groups, by how is that word being distributed? Or
what is the that? Do you mean the letter, or do you?
Well, and that particular concept.
Great question. So the letter would have circulated among different communities within Galatia, within that region in what's now modern-day Turkey. And so the vast majority of people in this period can't read and write. So if you can't read and write, there's no such thing as the Bible, right, that exists in the, very nicely bound HarperCollins Study Bible, right? This doesn't exist yet. And so the way that people would encounter, the way that they would hear this letter is that people would gather for church. People would gather, not like the way that we do today, but people would gather in homes. People would gather in people's homes. They would gather in catacombs. Remember we talked about how people thought that the church was pretty weird in the first century. And so you couldn't gather publicly yet in this period. And so people would gather in homes, they would gather in out-of-the-way kinds of places, and they would worship together. And as part of their worship, that someone would read these letters aloud. And so we talked, I think it was last week or 2 weeks ago, we talked about Phoebe the deacon in Romans. And so people like Phoebe, who were leaders in the early church, would be responsible for not only carrying the letter to these different communities, but they would also be responsible for the interpretation of the letter within the community. And so they would read the letter aloud within the context of worship, and then there would be an opportunity for the letter to be interpreted, and people would discuss it, and people would study it. And so it was all heard and discussed and debated. And so that's how people would encounter the text, because no one in this period is sitting down with their study Bible and like underlining the footnotes, right? Like it's all at this point, a very communal and very auditory kind of experience that's all happening within the context of worship. And so that's how people would encounter these ideas, is that, it'd be through relationships. Hey, do you want to come to this meeting with me? We're going to be talking about this guy named Jesus. And there was this guy named Paul who wrote this letter to our church. And we want to know what Paul had to say. And then they're all going to be very disappointed when he's very angry, right? But this is how this sort of communication would happen, is that it would all be within the context of worship. And so that's how these letters were originally heard, that's how they were originally interpreted. And letters like Galatians would originally travel, they would first be original gets complicated pretty quickly, but the letter itself would have gone to the church in Galatia, but then it would have circulated with other letters associated with Paul. So it would have circulated as part of a collection in the early, say, 1st and 2nd and 3rd centuries. So there would be these collections of letters that would circulate before what we now know as the New Testament itself was formed, which doesn't happen until the 4th and 5th centuries, which is another forum all by itself. We're not going to go down that rabbit hole today. Okay, any other comments or questions before I wrap up the last couple of verses here? Okay, I've got 4 minutes, and so I'm going to read just a couple more verses and give you a few more ideas to leave with for today. So, verse 25. So this is chapter 5, verse 25. If we live by the Spirit, and so just like flesh is a specific and technical term that means those things that tear apart the community, Spirit here is the things that build up the community. The Spirit is what's moving through the church. It's the building up of the church. And so if we live by the Spirit, if we live by these fruits like love and joy and patience and kindness, let us also be guided by the Spirit. So remember, this was the so what section. This is the what do we do with your teachings, Paul section. So he's saying if we live by the Spirit, if we embody these practices, then we will also be guided by the Spirit. Verse 26, let us not become conceited, competing against one another, envying one another. Remember, this is all of those things that Paul is arguing against. That if we compete with one another and we envy one another, this breaks down the church. This breaks down the body of Christ. So I'll just read 2 more verses here. My friends, if anyone is detected in a transgression, you who have received the Spirit should restore one another in a spirit of gentleness. Take care that you yourselves are not tempted. And then verse 2 of chapter 6, bear one another's burdens, and in this way you fulfill the law of Christ. So remember how we've talked continually about how the law doesn't go away, but the law is something that now gets reinterpreted in light of Christ. So what Paul is saying here is that what fulfills the law, and specifically what fulfills the law of Christ, is bearing one another's burdens. That to embody the Spirit, to be guided by the Spirit, is to bear one another's burdens, is to be in community together. And this is what Paul is calling the church to be. This is what Paul is calling the church to embody. All right. I have had such a delightful time with all of you, and I want to say thank you for your questions and for your comments and for your wrestlings with this material. Paul is not easy. Paul is not an easy figure to work with, and so I want to just say a word of gratitude and thanks for all of your questions and all of the discussion that we've been able to have together, and thank you again for the invitation to be among you these past 3 weeks.
Thank you, Crystal, so much. If you'd like to keep the conversation going with Crystal, you can see more about her on crystalhallphd.com. So some of the other ministries that you're involved in and lead. So again, thank you so much for being with us.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you. Take care, everybody.